Well, good morning. Thank you for just having us back in your home again. It's really a lovely day. I just am really excited about the presentation that is coming up. I want to take you to see this fabulous picture that Sherry has taken for us. We were on a hike in the Sierras, going along a trail. This is springtime. You can see the new leaves coming up, and there's a lot of branches where the sap is starting to run and the ground cover is just starting to emerge. And we come across these bright red flowers, or what we thought were actually mushrooms. And it turns out it's a plant that feeds on the fungus in the ground. Um, I I had never seen them before, and the folks we were with said, "Well, these are snow mushrooms." Well, Sherry did some research on it, and it turns out that they are called snow flowers, and most of them are white. So we get these beautiful red ones. We're so glad to be able to bring you this extraordinary plant that comes up just after the snow melts in very early spring. So thank you, Sherry. What a great adventure to be on. All right, so we are still in the Gospel of Mark. We're at chapter 14. I've broken chapter 14 up into four parts. This is the second one. The title is Learning to Love God. And I want to explain that because the two characters in the story that are really prominent characters both know Jesus personally, but Jesus has a conversation about loving God. So I hope you enjoy it. It is a vitally important story. So let's jump right in. We're in Mark 14. There is a plot that is unfolding. This would be picking up from last week. It says, now the Passover and the unleavened bread were 2 days away. And the chief priests and the scribes were seeking how to seize Jesus, seize him by stealth and kill him. Did you catch that? The murder plot is unfolding. That is Mark 14, chapter 1. Now let's go to verse 2. For they were saying, well, not during the festival, otherwise there might be a riot of the people. Now, here's what is interesting to me. I find it absolutely fascinating that the scribes and the Pharisees in this murder plot are still totally fearful of the people because they know they are going against what the majority of the people agree with. But they cannot be deterred. They are going to pursue their hatred and their plot to murder Jesus. Now, Mark chapter 14 does a most remarkable thing. Here we are in the middle of this plot to murder Jesus. And guess what Mark does? As you would expect Mark to do, all of a sudden, he introduces us to a really important story, a side story that is unfolding while this plot is being planned. We meet Mary Magdalene in this chapter of Mark. And, I really appreciate the artist's work here. This is not really intended to be Mary Magdalene. It is a Middle Eastern woman and just one of those really great, great artists. Excuse me. And I really appreciate the fact that he took time to address the cultural appearance of what Mary could have looked like. So, Mary Magdalene, she has been called many things. The historians say that there is good evidence that Mary was most likely sexually abused by her uncle Simon, the leper. Now, this resulted in her being a very promiscuous person. Others would say she was actually the woman caught in adultery by the Pharisees trying to trap Jesus. But there's more to this story than just that. So hang on as we unfold what's recorded. Now, I'm going to jump ahead to Mark 16, verse 9, because it is going to tell us something important about who Mary Magdalene was and how she was healed. Okay? It reads in Mark 16, verse 9, Jesus first appeared to Mary Magdalene, from whom he had cast out 7 demons. One author I read discussed this concept of the demon of lust that had taken possession of her. And I don't think he was wrong. I think he was really onto something very important. But what was the result of the abuse and the trauma for Mary? Actually, it turned out to be demonic possession. So when we look at the lust that drove Mary Magdalene in her life, her brokenness, her dysfunction, Jesus healed her by casting out 7 demons. I believe it was the result of the trauma and the abuse she experienced as a young girl or a young woman from her uncle. So what makes this such a significant story for you and I is the healing that took place emotionally and spiritually for those who are physically and sexually abused is right here in the heart of the gospel. It is a story of the power of faith and the heart responding to the unconditional love of God. And Jesus, in the midst of this story, in the healing for Mary Magdalene, cast out 7 demons. And his agape love was accepted by Mary, and it healed her from those deep scars, and she became the one story that will always be told whenever we speak or share the gospel of Jesus Christ. That is how important this story is. So there's much for us to learn. Let's look at Mark 14 now. Let's go to chapter 3 and pick up our story. While he was in Bethany, at the home of Simon the leper, and reclining at the table, there came a woman, we know this to be Mary Magdalene, with an alabaster vial of very costly perfume of pure nard. And she broke the vial and poured it over his head. But some were indignantly remarking to one another, "Why is this perfume being wasted?" Now, we're going to show you evidence that we know this conversation of the criticism of Mary was led by Judas, who was the treasurer of the disciples. In fact, I want to tell you right now that we are going to go into the Gospel of John and the Gospel of Luke to put some more flesh on this story so you really get to meet the people involved in it. So I hope you enjoy that. In verse 5 of Mark 14, Mark records this, "For this perfume might have been sold for over 300 denarii, and the money given to the poor." And they were scolding her. Now, when you see 300 denarii, that is a year's wages. So let's say the average income today happens to be $60,000 a year. Well, maybe that's too much. Maybe it's only 55,000 or 50,000. All I want you to know is that when Mary brought this perfume to anoint Jesus, it cost her a year's wages for a bottle of ointment, of perfume. A year's wages. And what is she doing? Well, she's going to pour it on Jesus' head and on his feet and anoint him before the crucifixion. And what is Judas and the disciples doing? Naturally finding fault and criticizing. Remember, they haven't been to the cross yet. They're still growing and maturing and growing spiritually, and you can see that they're just real people in the midst of this story. But Jesus said in verse 6, "Let her alone. Why do you bother her? She has done a good deed to me." He puts them in their place and says, "Hey, guys, what she is doing is a good thing. And apparently that's what they did. They apparently backed down and stopped going after Mary. Now, notice how this is recorded, the same story by John the disciple, who is also a witness firsthand. And here's what's recorded in John chapter 12. We're going to look at verses 3 through 8 if you have your Bible. It says, Mary then took a pound of very costly perfume of pure nard and anointed the feet of Jesus and wiped his feet with her hair, and the house was filled with the fragrance of perfume. But Judas Iscariot, here's my evidence, one of his disciples was intending to betray him, said, why was this perfume not sold for 300 denarii and given to poor people? Now let's pause here for just a moment. That sounds so righteous. What an important thing to do. We could just think if we had $50,000, we could help so many poor people. Why are you letting this woman pour this on Jesus? Think of all the poor people we could help. Wow. You can see the tension is building here. Even in the Gospel of John, we encounter the same attitude, and John is recording the same behavior. It's stunning on how these men feel responsible for someone else's behavior. Now, clinically today, we would call that codependency. But there's something else going on here with Judas, okay? It's going to be unfolded in the story. So I don't want to run ahead. I think you'll find it out here shortly. In John chapter 12, in verse 6. Now he said this, not because he was concerned about the poor, but because he was a thief. And as he had the money box, he used to pilfer what was in it. He was the church treasurer, if you would, and he was helping himself to the money. Can I pause here for just a moment? I've been in ministry for, well, pretty close to 40 years now. And here's something I've learned. I think Sherry and I have witnessed over the years that we have found the people who are the most vocal and the most critical and the most accusatory, without exception almost, we have found that there are things in those folks' lives that are really, really big, that are out of control. And they're compensating by accusing or criticizing others. I cannot tell you, I've got 40 years of witnessing that, and it's stunning. And here we find it in John 12. A man who himself had compromised his own faith by helping himself to the disciples' funds is the one who's making the biggest deal. Oh, look, we could be giving this to the poor. Sounds so self-righteous, doesn't it? Causes you to pause and think about this for just a moment more. Now in John, he records in verse 7, therefore Jesus said, let her alone so that she may keep it for the day of my burial. For you always have the poor with you, but you do not always have me. Now, this is a significant text. We'll have more to say about that in just a moment, but don't forget those words. Let me just share them with you again. You always have the poor with you, but you will not or do not always have me. Just tuck that away for a bit. We're going to go to the Gospel of Luke now. I want you to notice in Luke chapter 7, we're going to start with verse 40. Jesus answered him, Simon, I have something to say to you. And he replied, say it, teacher. And here's the parable that Jesus shared. In verse 41, a moneylender had two debtors. One owed 500 denarii and the other 50. So 500 denarii is almost 2 years' wages, and you can see 50 would be a very small portion of that. Verse 42, when they were unable to repay, he graciously forgave them both. So which one of them will love him more? Simple story, isn't it? Now notice Simon in verse 43. Simon answered and said, I suppose the one whom he forgave more. And Jesus answers, he said to him, you have judged correctly. Now, keep in mind, we have Mary Magdalene, we have Judas and the disciples carrying on, and we also know that Simon the abuser is now coming into the story in Luke. Now, what does Jesus know about Simon and about Mary Magdalene? That she had been abused, had been taken possession of by 7 demons. One of them we know was lust. And that Simon was the causing person in the story. And what did he just say to Simon? The one who's been forgiven the most will love the master the most. Are you paying attention to that? Because it is so vitally important. So in Luke 7, verse 44, turning towards the woman, he said to Simon. Now, catch the body language here. Jesus is looking at Mary and talking to Simon. Do you see this woman? I entered your house. You gave me no water for my feet, but she has wet my feet with her tears and wiped them with her hair. You gave me no kiss, but she, since the time I came in, has not ceased to kiss my feet. The question was, the one who's forgiven the most loves the most. Simon, you get that? Verse 46 of Luke 7. Simon, you did not anoint my head with oil, but she anointed my feet with perfume. For this reason I say to you, her sins, which are many, have been forgiven, for she loved much. But he who is forgiven little loves little. And then he said to her, your sins have been forgiven. Now I want you to think, if you were Simon right now, would you say you were in need of a huge amount of forgiveness that you haven't really embraced even asking for? And here Mary, who has been forgiven much, spent a year to anoint Jesus for his burial before he even went to the cross. In verse 49, Luke records these words for us. Those who were reclining at the table with him began to say to themselves, who is this man who even forgives sins? And he said to the woman, your faith has saved you. Go in peace. You see this joy that Mary Magdalene has? When was the last time you spent a year's wages just out of the depth of your gratitude and gave it to the Lord? When was the last time you embraced the total amount you have been forgiven and your heart was thrilled to the very depths of your soul of the kindness and compassion of who Jesus was, that anything you could give just meant pure joy to you? I would say most of us are closer to Simon than we are to Mary Magdalene. But notice Mark 14, verse 7, we encounter this phrase again. For you always have the poor with you, and whenever you wish, you can do good to them, but you will not always have me. Now remember, I told you to tuck this passage away. Now here's why. Over the years, sitting in a multitude of board meetings for schools and for churches, I have heard people use this passage to not have to help those who are struggling and those who are less fortunate and those who are poor. They don't realize it, but they said, we're always going to have the poor. Let's go do something else with our money. It's using Jesus as an excuse not to help the poor. And Jesus didn't say that. And when that scripture is quoted, it's completely misunderstood. He's simply saying, I'm not going to be here forever, but you will always have to take care of those who are struggling, those who are less fortunate, those who are poor. But sometimes we turn that around when it comes to the money of the group or the money of the church. And that creates quite a unique and important conversation. Now let's go back to Mark 14. Let's pick it up here on verse 8. Jesus speaks. She has done what she could. She has anointed my body beforehand for the burial. So once again, Jesus has announced his death. And by the way, how did we begin this story? With those men who were plotting the murder of Christ. Now, Jesus, as usual, is being very open and speaking very clearly that his burial is coming. Did you catch that? And what has Mary done? Before my death, she has anointed me for the burial. That's just absolutely profound. And what drove Mary to do this? The depths of the joy of her heart of having been forgiven and having been restored for a life that was completely broken. In that new life of Christ, she couldn't be stopped from giving, may I say, beyond sacrificially. Profound, isn't it? What the goodness of God can do in the heart of any one of us, and what he has done in the heart of Mary Magdalene. Notice what Jesus says here. This is so important. Truly I say to you, wherever the gospel is preached in the whole world, what this woman has done will also be spoken in memory of her. Is that not beautiful? Let's pause here for just a moment now. I want to just dig in a little deeper here. What has this woman done? Well, we go back and look at her life of brokenness. She wasn't able to bond intimately. She wasn't able to have healthy relationships. Her promiscuity got her into trouble constantly. She was probably a scorned woman and probably more like the woman at the well than anyone else that we could meet in the New Testament, isolated and alone. But she encounters Jesus, and he sets her free from the bondage of sin for what evil had taken possession in her heart and in her life. And he had set her free, which is the very power of the gospel story. And what now is how she responds that is going to be shared every time the gospel is told, is that this is what happens in the heart of a person whom Jesus has forgiven, whom Jesus has restored, whom Jesus has welcomed into the family of God. And that out of that, each and every one of us, you and I, just like Mary Magdalene, have had that depth of forgiveness. The question is, are we filled with the same gratitude? Because that's what the gospel does. It fills you with gratitude because of God's love in restoring us in a healthy life, spiritually and in healthy relationships. It's profound. It is the heartbeat of the gospel itself. In the midst of that powerful story, verse 10, then Judas Iscariot, who was one of the 12, the guy who was pointing out all the bad things Mary was doing in John and Luke and Mark, went off to the chief priests in order to betray him to them. Judas hadn't even repented of his theft or his covetousness or his greed. Loveless, he goes off to betray Jesus, believing that he is going to be put in a political position of high power, and he can't wait. What a contrast to Mary. Isn't it beautiful how Mark has told the story? It says they were glad when they heard this and promised, this is the priests, they were glad when they heard this and promised to give Judas money, and he begins seeking how to betray him at an opportune time. I want to go to our picture that Sherry has brought to us. This pond is a pond that is just full of moss, and you can see these beautiful water lilies there, and they're coming up out of this murky water, just beautiful, just like Mary Magdalene, fully restored. What a blessing this story is about the power of Jesus Christ to restore someone who has been deeply, deeply broken, and fills her with gratitude that now becomes the shadow story of the gospel everywhere it's told. This is what it does to you. The best news in the entire world. So I want to thank Sherry for that beautiful picture. I hope you're enjoying the Gospel of Mark. See you soon. Take care now. Blessings.